People say a camera can't hide the truth, but with these music legends that idea feels even colder. In the moments just before death, the last photographs of Marvin Gaye, Whitney Houston, Michael Jackson, Prince, Aretha Franklin, and so many others quietly captured what no glossy interview or official statement ever dared to admit. Marvin is pressed against a wall in the same house where he would soon be killed. Whitney forces a party smile while her eyes look drained only hours before she is discovered in a hotel bathroom. Michael rehearses on stage, his body sagging under lights that reveal how little strength he has left. Prince stands tall, yet his clenched hands betray pain he refused to acknowledge. These were not farewell portraits arranged for history. They were warnings visible, recorded, and still ignored. In this story, we revisit 50 final photographs of black music legends and ask a question that is hard to breathe through where the ending's already visible in front of us, and we simply refuse to see. Marvin Gaye, the photograph inside a house that was no longer safe. Most people remember Marvin Gaye for a voice so gentle it seemed to comfort an entire restless era. But his last known photograph contains no sound at all. In March 1984, inside a rented house in Los Angeles, Marvin stands with his back almost touching the wall. His shoulders fold inward, his gaze slides away from the lens. The framing is tight, the light is weak, the curtains drawn shut, as if the room itself is hiding. According to the photographer, Marvin asked that the doors be locked before a single picture was taken. The image feels less like a casual portrait and more like evidence, a man bracing himself even in his own home. Just weeks later, on April 1, Marvin Gaye was shot and killed by his father inside that same house. Looking back, the photograph stops being a memory. It becomes an unmarked crime scene waiting for a name. Prince, a posture of control before collapse. In mid-April 2016, at Paisley Park, Prince posed for what would become his final photograph. At first glance, he seems unshakable, standing tall, spine, straight eyes sharp and watchful. The image radiates control, the carefully curated presence of a man who built his career on mystery and precision. But if you look closely, the details betray him. His hands are stiff, fingers tensed, his neck draws slightly inward, as if he is holding back a wave of pain. Years of hip injuries had taken their toll. It was reported that Prince turned to powerful painkillers, managing his own medication, rather than surrendering that control to doctors. That last photograph now feels bitter. The image shows perfect composure. The body behind it does not. On April 21, 2016, Prince was found alone dead from a fentanyl overdose. The final picture freezes a contradiction, a man who looked completely in charge while his body was already failing him. Whitney Houston, when flashbulbs could not save anyone. Whitney Houston once had the kind of voice that could stop an entire room mid-breath. Yet on the night of February 9, 2012 at the Beverly Hilton, her final photograph captures the opposite of power. Under the harsh blast of flashbulbs, her eyes appear hollow and unfocused. Her hands, observers later noted, seem to tremble. The dress glitters. The smile feels like armor put on for the crowd. The party around her continued without pause. Many people sensed that something was off, but no one removed her from the spotlight. 2 days later, on February 11, the Whitney was found dead in a hotel bathtub with heart disease, drugs, and extreme exhaustion, all reported as factors. That last photograph is no longer just a red carpet moment. It is a record of a room full of people watching her unravel and not stopping the music. Michael Jackson, the rehearsal of a man who could not sleep. Michael Jackson was the man who kept the entire world awake. But in June 2009, during rehearsals for This Is It shows in Los Angeles, his final images reveal a performer pushed beyond human limits. In one frame, he bends forward under the stage lights. His shoulders slump. His eyes look sunken. You can almost feel the weight of his breathing. Behind that snapshot lies a stark reality: chronic, severe insomnia. Sleep had become something Michael could only reach with powerful medical intervention given at home. His bedroom functioned less like a sanctuary and more like an improvised clinic. On June 25, 2009, he died in that bedroom. Now the rehearsal photograph carries a twisted irony. The man who kept audiences awake across continents lost his life because he could no longer sleep. Aretha Franklin, the silence of a queen. Aretha Franklin did not stage a grand farewell. In August 2018 in Detroit, one of her rare final photographs shows a woman dramatically thinner, her voice nearly gone. There is no crowd, no spotlight, just stillness that feels deliberate. The shock of the image comes from what had been hidden. For years, Aretha had quietly battled pancreatic cancer, choosing not to publicly announce her illness or organize a farewell tour. On August 16, 2018, she died at home. Looking at that photograph now, it feels like the closing of a curtain she controlled to the very end. The Queen of Soul decided even how her exit would sound, not with a final high note, but with a silence that says everything. Jimi Hendrix, the quiet moment before everything shattered. Something about Jimi Hendrix's last photograph seems unnatural. The man who had once set stages on fire is suddenly surrounded by stillness. Taken in London, in early September 1970, the picture shows Jimi seated, no guitar in sight, no smoke, no crowd. His shoulders sag slightly. His eyes drift off as if searching for a sound only he can hear. By that time, he was worn down, relentless touring creative pressure that never let up, and nights stretched thin by alcohol and sedatives. According to those close to him, Jimi was desperate to escape contracts and people who insisted on controlling his every move, but he could not find a clean way out. On September 18, 1970, he died in a London hotel after taking a large amount of sleeping medication. In hindsight, that final photograph feels like a brief pause between storms, the last calm moment before the guitar went silent forever. Sam Cooke, the smile that sends a chill down your spine. Sam Cooke's final photograph, taken in early December 1964 in Los Angeles, would seem ordinary if you didn't know the story behind it. He wears a sharp suit, hair perfectly styled. His face is calm, composed, the kind of polished image fans were used to seeing. What chills the viewer is what happened days later. On the night of December 11, 1964, Sam Cooke was shot and killed at the Hacienda Motel. The official story labeled the shooting as self-defense, but many aspects of that night were never fully clarified, and debates about what really happened have never completely ended. When you revisit the photograph with that knowledge, Sam's relaxed smile no longer feels warm. It becomes the final expression before a night whose truth may never be entirely known. Otis Redding, the photograph before the fatal flight. In Otis Redding's last photograph, taken in December 1967 in Wisconsin, he looks almost shining with life. His smile is broad, his eyes bright, his energy unmistakable. Nothing in the frame suggests danger. He appears to be a young man in motion, touring constantly, preparing for another show, certain that the future is his. But on December 10, 1967, the small plane carrying him and members of his band crashed into Lake Monona in bad weather. Otis Redding was only 26. Looking at that photograph now, the ache does not come from fear, but from the clear sense of a future that had just begun and was suddenly erased. James Brown, when the stage disappeared. The world remembers James Brown in motion, sweating, dancing, shouting into a microphone as if he could never stop. His final photograph shows a different man. Taken in late 2006 in Atlanta inside a private setting where he rarely allowed cameras, he is seated almost still. His shoulders drop. His once sharp suit hangs looser. His eyes stare ahead, not searching for an audience, just staring through the room. People avoid talking about this period because it doesn't match the legend. Behind the quiet image are years of heart problems, lung issues, and a body worn down by decades of non-stop performing and hard living. Those around him said that even then he tried to stay in charge, giving instructions while struggling to breathe. On December 25, 2006, James Brown died of heart failure. No stage, no spotlight, no encore. That final photograph doesn't just show the fall of a superstar. It captures the exact moment a man stopped forcing himself to stand up for everyone else. Tina Turner, a face that no longer had to run. Tina Turner's last photograph does not shock, and that is exactly why it hurts. Taken at her home in Switzerland, in the years leading up to her death on May 24, 2023, it shows an older woman sitting quietly. No flames on stage, no crowd, no choreography, just Tina, her eyes deep and unhurried. If you only glance at the image, you see aging. But if you know her life, you see a long distance traveled. She had survived brutal domestic abuse, years of being controlled, and multiple breakdowns, physical and emotional. In her later years, she faced serious health problems, including kidney failure and long, draining treatments. At one point, she acknowledged that choosing to keep going required enormous strength. That is why this final photograph does not look like someone simply reaching the end of the road. It looks like a woman who no longer has to run for anyone. Billie Holiday, the photograph taken under guard. Some final photographs are not taken to remember someone. They are taken to watch them. In 1959, in a New York hospital room, Billie Holiday lay in a bed so still she barely looked alive. Her body was painfully thin, her face swollen from advanced liver failure. Tubes, wires, and the flat white walls replaced any trace of a stage. The most shocking detail was not even in the frame. Outside the edge of the photograph, police officers stood guard in her room. Even as she was dying, Billie was under investigation for alleged drug involvement, treated less like a patient and more like a suspect. The woman who had poured her soul into songs about pain and injustice was denied peace, even in her final days. On July 17, 1959, Billie Holiday died in that hospital. Her last image is not just a record of a fading body. It exposes a system that never stopped punishing her, even at the very end. Nina Simone, the gaze of someone too tired to keep fighting. When you look at Nina Simone's final photograph, the first thing you feel is not rage. It is exhaustion. Taken in the early 2000s in France, where she spent her later years in a kind of self-imposed exile, Nina sits almost motionless. Her posture is heavy, her eyes droop with a weight that words cannot carry. The truth behind that gaze is complicated and devastating. Nina lived for years with a severe mental health disorder that was never fully or consistently treated. Add to that the loneliness of distance from home, the pressure of being a symbol, and a lifetime of fighting battles on stage and off. On April 21, 2003, Nina Simone died in her sleep. The final photograph feels less like an image of defeat and more like a quiet verdict. Some geniuses pay for their brilliance with their own peace of mind. Ray Charles, when the light faded behind dark glasses. Ray Charles spent his life behind dark glasses that became part of his legend. But in his final photograph taken in 2004 in California, the familiar pose carries a different meaning. He is seated thinner than before, his body visibly weakened. There is no piano in front of him, no crowd waiting for a song. Just Ray, still in his trademark shade, sitting in a calm, almost empty space. Behind that stillness are years of fighting liver disease and related complications. He knew his time was running out, yet he continued working quietly, finishing what would become his last album. On June 10, 2004, Ray Charles passed away. Looking back at that final image, people see something quietly profound. The man who navigated a world he could not see had understood his own ending with complete clarity. Donny Hathaway, the photograph before the mind shattered. In Donny Hathaway's last known photograph taken in 1979, in New York, nothing looks obviously wrong. He appears thoughtful, his eyes deep as if he is quietly reflecting on something distant. There are no visible alarms in the frame. The danger, however, was inside. Donny suffered from severe paranoid disorders. He became convinced that forces were watching and controlling him. At some point he stopped taking his prescribed medication and his grip on reality began to split apart. On January 13, the 1979 Donny Hathaway fell from a hotel window and died. That final photograph has since been reinterpreted as the last calm before his mind fully broke, a fragile moment of stillness before everything within him shattered. Al Green, the photograph after surviving death. Al Green's final photograph does not show a man approaching the end of his life. It shows a man who had already come close to death and turned in another direction. Taken in his later years in Memphis, the image captures a calm, composed figure with a different look in his eyes compared to his younger superstar days. The hidden story behind that calm stretches back to 1974, when Al Green was scalded with boiling water by his girlfriend, who later died by suicide. That violent, traumatic event pushed him away from the peak of secular fame he was climbing and toward a new life as a pastor. When people look at that last photograph now, they understand that some artists don't die young. Instead, they allow an old version of themselves to die so that they can keep living at all. Bobby Womack, the face of someone who lived too much. In Bobby Womack's final photograph, taken in early 2014 in California, he is seated, his face carved by fatigue and time. It's the look of someone who has taken too many hard roads and has finally run out of detours. His expression is not dramatic. It is simply worn. What the image does not immediately reveal is the weight he was carrying: cancer, diabetes, long-term struggles with addiction, and layers of family loss. Bobby once said he wasn't afraid of dying. What scared him was running out of time to make things right. On June 27, 2014, he passed away. That last image is not about celebrity status. It is about the cost of a life lived with almost no breaks. Curtis Mayfield, the gaze from a wheelchair. Curtis Mayfield's final photograph, taken in the late 1990s in Chicago, shows him in a wheelchair, body fragile, but eyes alert and unmistakably alive. The man who once stood tall on stage driving entire crowds now sits anchored to a chair, yet there is no surrender in his gaze. In 1990, a lighting rig fell on him during a performance, leaving him paralyzed from the neck down and ending his ability to perform the way he once had. Still, Curtis continued to write and record, working within the limits his body allowed. On December 26, 1999, he died from complications related to his condition. That last photograph doesn't ask for pity. It stands as proof that a spirit can remain upright even when the body cannot. Wilson Pickett, when the room became too quiet. Wilson Pickett was known as Wicked Pickett, the man whose voice once tore through speakers and concert halls. Yet his final photograph, taken in late 2005 in Virginia, shows something entirely different. He is sitting in a quiet room, no stage, no band, his eyes sunk in his breathing, visibly strained. The silence around him is heavy. Behind that stillness were years of heart disease, repeated hospital stays, and a body battered by a hard, relentless lifestyle. On January 19, 2006, Wilson Pickett died of a heart attack. For a man whose life was defined by sound and energy, the final moment was pure silence, and this time it did not break. Etta James, with no stage left to stand on. If you glance at Etta James' last photograph without knowing the story, you might simply see a tired woman. But once you learn it was taken in 2011 in a California hospital, the image hits differently. Her face is swollen. Her eyes seem unfocused. The body that once powered one of the fiercest voices in music looks fragile, nearly beyond repair. Etta had spent her life wrestling with addiction and with herself, carrying scars from both. In her final years, leukemia and dementia weakened her further, pulling her away from the person the world remembered. On January 20, 2012, she died. The photograph doesn't dramatize the end. It quietly states a harsh fact. Some of the greatest voices are paid for with the body itself. Gladys Knight, the one who remains. Gladys Knight's photograph is not a deathbed scene. There's no hospital equipment, no date marking her final day. Taken in recent years while she is still alive, it shows her facing the camera with a gentle smile. But her eyes carry a different story. Over the decades, Gladys has watched peers, collaborators, rivals, and friends disappear one by one. Bandmates are gone. Icons she once shared stages with now exist only in recordings and in images like the ones in this story. The weight in her gaze is not just age. It is survival. This photograph reminds us that sometimes the heaviest burden does not fall on the ones who leave early, but on those who stay long enough to remember everyone. Stevie Wonder when the room grew quieter than the stage. There came a time when Stevie Wonder appeared less and less in public, and the silence around him began to say more than the applause ever could. In one of his later photographs taken in recent years, in a private setting, he sits close to a piano. His back is slightly curved, his head tilted downward. There is no audience, no full song, just a few notes touched and then left unfinished. Stevie is still alive. This is not a farewell picture, but it does feel like an ending of a certain rhythm of life. Few people talk about the loneliness that shadows genius, the relationships that cracked under pressure, the weight of being an icon since childhood, the expectations that never let him simply be ordinary. In this image, it looks as though he is not playing for a crowd anymore. He is playing for his own memories after the world has already listened to him for far too long. Isaac Hayes, the moment he sat down and never stood again. In the summer of 2008, Isaac Hayes still had bookings on his calendar. There were shows to do, appearances to honor, a powerful image to maintain. But backstage at an event, someone snapped a photograph that now feels chilling. He is sitting longer than usual, his shoulders sinking, his breathing clearly labored. There is no stage light, no dramatic pose, just a man who looks like he is carrying something too heavy. Behind that single frame lies a storm of problems, a stroke he had suffered earlier, lingering health issues, financial disputes, tax debts, and the relentless pressure to keep up the appearance of strength. On August 10, 2008, Isaac Hayes died from cardiovascular complications. Looking back, that photograph was not a quiet break between performances. It was the moment his body started making the final decision for him after years of ignoring its warnings. Smokey Robinson, a smile after going too far. Smokey Robinson almost always smiles in pictures. But in this particular photograph taken later in his life, the smile feels different. There is no microphone, no stage, no elaborate set, just Smokey sitting and talking, his expression gentle but subdued. His eyes seem calmer, as if they've traveled a long way and finally slowed down. He is still alive. Yet this image feels like the end of a spiritual journey. Years earlier, Smokey had battled severe cocaine addiction and deep depression during the height of Motown. He nearly lost his family, his career, and himself. At one point, he reportedly said he did not recognize the person looking back at him in the mirror. This final photograph is not about collapse. It is about a man who went frighteningly far away from who he was and then walked back slowly enough to keep living. Diana Ross, moments before going on stage. For some people, stopping simply isn't an option. One of Diana Ross's later photographs taken backstage just before she walks into the spotlight captures that reality perfectly. Her dress is being adjusted, every fold in place. Her hair is flawless. Her posture is straight, every inch of her body prepared to be seen. Diana is still alive. This is not a last picture on Earth moment, but it does feel like the closing of a long ritual repeated for decades. Few people talk openly about her private life, broken relationships, constant scrutiny, endless comparisons, and the loneliness that can come from always being the center of attention. The photograph shows a woman who cannot afford to be tired. Fame in her case is not just brightness. It is duty. Even in that quiet backstage moment, she does not belong entirely to herself. Florence Ballard, When History Stopped Calling. In Detroit, in early 1976, there was no Motown glamour, no supreme spotlight left for Florence Ballard. Her final photograph shows a woman with a weary face and a body rapidly fading. The star power that once surrounded her is gone. The expression she wears is not anger but a heavy kind of resignation. After being pushed out of the group, She helped create Florence, slid into poverty, deep depression, and alcohol abuse. The industry that had once benefited from her voice did not stay to catch her when she fell. On February 22 and 1976, Florence Ballard died from heart and lung complications at just 32 years old. The photograph hurts because it shows someone who once stood at the center of music history reduced to someone the world barely remembered. A voice that helped shape an era was allowed to fade as if it had never been there. Mary Wells fighting cancer in her final years. Mary Wells, once known as the first queen of Motown, spent her final years in a hospital room in California. Her last photograph shows her sitting quietly, no microphone in her hand, no band behind her, only the harsh simplicity of a medical setting. Throat cancer had progressed so severely that Mary could barely speak. A woman whose identity was built around her voice now had to communicate with those around her through written words. She remained fully aware, watching the life she once lived drift further and further away. On July 26, 1992, Mary Wells passed away. The last image feels like a cruel reversal, a singer whose weapon was sound forced into a silence she did not choose. Tammy Terrell Payne inside the hospital. Tammy Terrell had a radiant smile, and in her final photograph, taken in early 1970, in a hospital room, that smile is still there. She is lying in bed, undergoing treatment for a brain tumor after multiple unsuccessful surgeries. Her body is weakened and failing, but she still tries to look cheerful whenever someone walks in. What the photograph doesn't show is the deeper pain she carried, years of physical abuse in past relationships and emotional wounds that never had time to heal. On March 16, 1970, Tammy Terrell died at just 24 years old. Her last photograph is not dramatic. It is simply a young woman's future being quietly taken away before it ever had a chance to fully begin. Phyllis Hyman, a goodbye no one expected. No one thought the photograph taken of Phyllis Hyman in 1995 at her New York apartment would be a farewell. She appears calm, lightly made up, her expression subdued but collected. There is nothing in the frame that screams final moment. But behind that composed exterior, Phyllis was fighting severe depression, repeated career disappointments, and a reliance on sleeping pills just to make it through the night. She once admitted she was tired of always having to appear strong for everyone else. On June 30, 1995, she was found dead following an overdose. The pain of this last photograph lies in that quiet surface. There were no dramatic warnings, only a long stretch of silence that no one around her could fully decode in time. Luther Vandross, a heart that had grown tired. After suffering a stroke in 2003, Luther Vandross was never quite the same. His final photograph, taken in 2005, during his recovery, shows him seated, speaking slowly, movements careful and limited. The man whose voice once soared effortlessly now had to work just to form words and gestures. He knew his voice would never fully return to what it had been. For someone who lived his entire life through song, that realization was devastating. Few people talk about how privately lonely he was, or about the relationships and parts of his life that were kept out of the public eye. On July 1, 2005, Luther Vandross died. The final image feels like a quiet nod of acceptance from a heart that had simply grown too tired to keep fighting. Teddy Pendergrass seated in a wheelchair. A car accident in 1982 left Teddy Pendergrass paralyzed from the chest down. It did not, however, destroy his will to exist on his own terms. In his later years, his final photograph shows him seated in a wheelchair, his eyes still sharp, his presence still unmistakable. He continued to record and make public appearances, adapting to a life radically different from the one he once imagined. Behind that strength were deep psychological battles, anger, grief, and eventually a hard-won acceptance of his new reality. On January 13, 2010, Teddy Pendergrass died from complications related to his injuries and health issues. That last photograph does not read as defeat. It shows survival beyond what fate originally tried to allow. Just before the tragedy. On August 25, 2001, Ayala left a video shoot in the Bahamas, tired but still working through a demanding schedule. Her final photograph shows her walking toward a small plane, sunglasses on her face, calm but clearly worn. It looks like a routine travel day for a rising star who was constantly in motion. According to people around her, Ayala was uneasy about flying, especially in small aircraft. But the schedule was tight and the pressure to move quickly was constant. The plane she boarded was later reported to be overloaded, carrying more weight than it should have. Moments after takeoff, it went down. Ayala was only 22 years old. In that last image, there is no drama, no visible warning, just a young woman stepping into what she believed was the next stop in a long career. Only later did the photograph become something else, the record of a decision made in seconds that ended an entire future. DMX, the final hours. DMX spent most of his life fighting battles the public thought they understood: addiction, prison time, relapse, and the heavy guilt of not being able to fully escape any of it. In his final days, he was surrounded by machines and family members instead of concert speakers and crowds. His last known photograph shows him unresponsive in a hospital bed, relatives gathered close, praying and hoping for a turnaround. Throughout his career, DMX had been open about his struggles with substances and the emotional damage that fueled them. The world often labeled him as a problem, but behind the headlines was a man who never stopped trying to climb out of his own past. On April 9, 2021, he died after suffering a heart attack linked, according to reports, to his long-term battles with drugs. The final image strips away the tough, larger-than-life persona. It leaves only a man who had spent years fighting himself, and in the end simply ran out of strength. Tupac before the fatal gunfire. Las Vegas, the night of September 7, 1996. After a high-profile boxing match, Tupac Shakur moved through a city buzzing with energy and tension. One of his final images shows him on a stretcher, bandaged and connected to medical equipment, caught between life and whatever waited on the other side. Before that, he had been photographed in a car with Suge Knight, sitting in the passenger seat, the picture of a star who thought it was just another dangerous but familiar night. Minutes later, gunfire erupted. Tupac was struck multiple times. For 6 days, he remained in the hospital machines, doing the work his body could no longer handle. On September 13, 1996, he died. His last photograph in the hospital does not show the outspoken, defiant figure the world knew. It shows a young man whose life had been wrapped in violence, paranoia, and a constant sense of being hunted, finally unable to outrun any of it. The notorious B.I.G. sitting in the car minutes before the shots. Los Angeles, March 9, 1997. After leaving a crowded party, hosted by a major magazine, Christopher Wallace, the notorious B.I.G. sat in the back seat of a dark SUV. His final photograph captures him glancing toward the camera, a slight smile on his face, his head tilted, as if the night were just one more stop in a busy career. Behind that calm expression was a life under extreme pressure, East Coast-West Coast feuds, label expectations, rising fame, and a constant awareness that retaliation and danger might be close. Moments after that photo was taken, the car stopped at a red light. Shots were fired into the vehicle. Biggie was only 24 years old. The last image is haunting precisely because nothing appears unusual. It looks like a routine ride home, a quiet pause before sleep. In reality, it was the final moment before an empire still being built was cut short in seconds. Nate Dogg, heavy breathing after repeated resuscitations. In his final years, Nate Dogg was seen more often sitting than standing. Multiple strokes had left their mark on his body, slowing his movements and limiting his strength. His last photograph shows him without a microphone, without a stage, just a man focusing on the simple act of breathing. The voice that had powered some of the most memorable hooks in hip-hop now struggled against the limits of a damaged body. Behind the image were long struggles with health, financial strain, and the lingering consequences of a life lived at intense speed. On March 15, 2011, Nate Dogg died from complications related to his strokes. The final photograph is quiet, almost painfully so. It reminds us that even the strongest voices eventually face a moment when breathing, not performing, becomes the only task that matters. Biz Markie, a tired smile after months of dialysis. Biz Markie built his career on humor, mischief, and joy. His final photograph, however, shows a very different side. Leaning back, he offers a small, tired smile, one that tries to be playful, but can't fully hide the fatigue in his eyes. Behind that expression were years of battling diabetes, kidney failure, and long stretches of dialysis treatments. He continued to use jokes and light-hearted gestures to soften the reality, but his body told a more serious story. On July 16, 2021, Biz Markie passed away. That last image is a quiet reminder that the loudest laughter can be a shield. It shows a man still trying to make others feel better while his own strength was nearly gone. Coolio, a bathroom break that never ended. On September 28, 2022, Coolio visited a friend's home in Los Angeles. His last known photograph shows him relaxed offstage and out of the spotlight, looking like someone enjoying a simple, ordinary day. There is nothing in the frame that feels like a warning. Later, he went into the bathroom and did not return. According to reports, the cause of death involved fentanyl and other substances. Coolio's life had long balanced between the memory of Gangsta's Paradise fame and personal decline, health concerns, and evolving struggles. The final moment offers no dramatic farewell, just a brief private pause that, without anyone realizing it, became the end. McMillan, a quiet night in a Studio City home. In September 2018, at his home in Studio City, Los Angeles, McMillan was photographed looking calm, almost peaceful. The image shows a young man surrounded by the quiet of his own space, not the flash of a red carpet or the chaos of a tour. Behind that calm exterior, though, he was facing a tangled mix of depression, substance use, and creative pressure. He had been honest in his music about feeling overwhelmed and about using drugs as a way to cope. On September 7, 2018, McMillan died from an accidental overdose, according to official reports. The final photograph hurts, not because of what it shows, but because of what it hides: a storm inside a man who, in that frozen moment, looked like he might finally have found a little peace. Pop Smoke and Airbeam parental lights switched on too late. In the Hollywood Hills on the early morning of February 19, 2020, Pop Smoke was staying at a rented home, a temporary stop in a fast-growing career. A final photograph shows him confident, young, posing for social media, surrounded by symbols of new success. The address behind him, according to later reports, was exposed online in a way that made him vulnerable. Not long after intruders entered the house, shots were fired. Pop Smoke died at just 20 years old. The final image has since become a harsh lesson about visibility in the social media age, how quickly fame can turn a private location into a target. What once looked like a simple flex now reads like an unintentional invitation to danger. Juice WRLD, Chicago Airport, minutes before the seizure. Chicago, December 8, 2019. Surveillance and fan photos show Juice WRLD walking through the airport, clearly exhausted. His head is down. His steps seem heavy. To strangers, it might have looked like nothing more than a tired artist on another long-traveled day. Behind that image were deep struggles with opioid use, anxiety, and fear about the consequences that might come if his substances were discovered. Minutes after that final sighting, he suffered a seizure and collapsed. Juice WRLD died at 21. The last photograph does not show drama or chaos. It shows a young man on the move, carrying a weight no one around him could fully see, walking through a normal space toward a moment that would change everything. Little Richard sitting alone, the spotlight long gone. In his final days, Little Richard stayed mostly at home. The feather sequins and wild stage outfits were gone. His last photograph shows him sitting quietly, health visibly in decline from bone problems and heart issues. The once explosive performer looks still almost fragile. On May 9, 2020, Little Richard died. For someone who had once set stages on fire and shaped rock and roll itself, the ending was understated and solitary. That last picture is not about noise or rebellion. It is about the silence that eventually comes for even the loudest pioneers. Mahalia Jackson hospital bed, a voice grown tired. Chicago 1972. In Mahalia Jackson's final photograph, she is seen receiving treatment, her body weakened after years of chronic illness. The woman whose voice had carried hope and strength through the civil rights movement now lay under hospital lights, her frame noticeably smaller, her energy nearly gone. She had spent decades traveling, singing, and offering herself to communities in pain. The emotional and physical toll was enormous. On January 27, 1972, Mahalia Jackson passed away. That last image is not a performance. It is faith standing firm while the body that once held it up finally gives way. Shirley Caesar, after the sermon, standing still for a long time. Shirley Caesar is still alive. Her photograph is not a farewell, but it carries the weight of decades. Taken after a sermon, she stands at the pulpit, breathing slowly, hands resting on the lectern. The choir has finished. The congregation is quiet. For a moment she remains there, as if rooted by everything she has carried. Few see the strain behind a lifetime of ministry, the personal losses, leadership burdens, and endless expectations. This image captures not the end of a life, but the end of a service where faith must keep going, even as the body begins to feel the cost of every word spoken. Andra Crouch, A Quiet Studio, an unfinished hymn. In his final days, Andra Crouch stayed close to the studio that had defined so much of his work. His last photograph shows him sitting in silence, no choir behind him, no crowd waiting for a crescendo. Equipment surrounds him, but the room feels still. His health had been declining due to heart complications, and the man known for powerful soaring gospel arrangements was now moving slowly, conserving strength. On January 8, 2015, Andra Crouch died. The photograph feels like a song cut off before its final note, not a dramatic collapse, just a hymn laid down gently, needing no more applause. Rance Allen, after the song, sitting down for a long rest. In October 2020, after singing at church, Rance Allen sat down to rest. Someone captured a photograph of him breathing slowly, the fatigue clear in his posture. The man, recognized for his incredible vocal range and emotional delivery, suddenly looked like someone who had poured everything out and had almost nothing left. Days later, on October 31, 2020, Rance Allen died due to heart-related complications. The final image is not theatrical. It is simply a moment when a man who gave all he had to his voice finally needed to sit down and didn't get back up. Solomon Burke, sitting on an airplane seat, a journey with no destination. In October 2010, Solomon Burke boarded a flight to Amsterdam to continue a European tour. His last photograph shows him seated on the plane, large frame, filling the seat, breathing heavily, but still facing forward as if ready for yet another show. He was known to live with diabetes, heart disease, and the weight of a huge family and legacy, yet he continued touring to support them and his own name. When the plane landed, Solomon Burke did not wake up. He had died during the flight. The final moment belongs to a man who spent his life singing gospel and soul, passing away in the middle of a journey he never allowed himself to end. Ben A. King, tired smile after the spotlight. In his later years, Ben A. King moved more slowly, appearing only occasionally in public. His final photograph shows him sitting quietly, offering a gentle smile, his eyes softer and more distant than in the days of Stand By Me. Behind that smile was long-term illness, managed mostly out of public view, even as his songs continued to be used in films, commercials, and tributes far beyond his control. On April 30, 2015, Ben A. King died. The last image is not about fame. It shows someone who once stood beside the world, now seated alone with memories only he could fully feel. Chuck Berry, the empty room of someone who lived too long. Chuck Berry lived long enough to watch music change again and again. In his final photograph taken in 2017 at his home in Missouri, he sits alone in a quiet room. There is no guitar in his hands, no crowd leaning toward the stage, just an older man inside his own space. His life had been full of contradictions, brilliance, legal troubles, accusations, acclaim, and isolation. Even near 90, he still talked about new music. But on March 18, 2017, Chuck Berry died at home. The final photograph is not heroic or dramatic. It is simply the silence left after someone has made noise for nearly a century. Fats Domino sitting in New Orleans after the storm. Fats Domino nearly lost his life during Hurricane Katrina, trapped in his flooded New Orleans home. In his final photograph taken later, he is seated quietly, his large body weakened by multiple chronic illnesses. The city he loved had been ravaged, and he no longer felt strong enough or willing to leave it again. On October 24, 2017, Fats Domino died. The last image feels like the slow closing of a chapter, a man who had survived disaster and fame, choosing to stay rooted in the place that had given him everything, even as time finally caught up. Gil Scott-Heron returning from the final trip. In 2011, Gil Scott-Heron returned from a trip to London, noticeably thinner and fragile. His last photograph shows him standing still, eyes deeply sunken, wearing the weight of too many years of struggle. Few people knew the full extent of what he carried: crack addiction, health complications, including HIV, time in prison, and long stretches of isolation. He had once been called the conscience of a generation, warning America in his work about collapse, injustice, and decay. On May 27, 2011, Gil Scott-Heron died in New York. The final image leaves behind not shock but regret. The man who spent his life warning others about what could go wrong was not able to save himself from the very forces he described. What remains after all these photographs is not just sadness, but a question: how many signs were visible in real time on faces, in postures, in tired eyes, yet went unanswered? If there is one image in this story that made you pause longer, that tightened your chest for a moment, ask yourself why. And if you do not want these lives to be reduced to just tragedies, remember them fully: talent and flaws, glory and pain. Sometimes the only thing left we can do for them is to remember them correctly and remember them long enough. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors these stories,